My name is Clara, and during college, I worked part-time at the city's only old bookstore. It was a dream job for a literature student like me. The smell of aging paper, the comforting silence broken only by the turn of a page or the creak of the wooden floorboards. The store closed at 9 p.m., and being in a small, quiet town, I never felt afraid to handle the closing shift alone. The routine was always the same. Sweep the floors, straighten the shelves, balance the cash register, and finally, lock the heavy oak door. On that particular Tuesday night in November, a light drizzle had started to fall, leaving the streets empty and glistening under the yellowish glow of the streetlights. I was eager to get home, have a hot cup of tea, and finish an essay for my Wednesday class. It was just 5 minutes to 9 when the little bell on the door chimed, announcing one last customer. It was a figure I had never seen before. He was a middle-aged man, perhaps, with clothes that seemed a bit too damp for the light drizzle outside. His eyes, however, were the strangest thing. They were a very light blue and seemed to lock onto everything with a disconcerting intensity. Instead of browsing the shelves like most customers, he walked slowly down the main aisle, his hands in his pockets, just observing. I gave my standard employee smile and said, "Good evening, sir. We're closing in a few minutes, but feel free to look around. If you need help finding anything, just let me know." He only nodded, his piercing gaze never leaving me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I dismissed it, blaming the cold night and my fatigue. I continued with my tasks, discreetly sweeping near the counter, always keeping him in my peripheral vision. The silence in the store grew heavy, almost palpable, and the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock.
He finally stopped near the philosophy section and picked up a random book, flipping through it without really reading. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he asked, "Do you like working here alone at night?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't a typical customer inquiry. I tried to remain calm and answered casually, "Oh, it's peaceful. The town is very safe." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Safe is a relative word, don't you think? So many things can happen in the dark when no one is watching." He placed the book back on the shelf, but did so with a deliberate slowness, as if to prolong the moment. "I see you in here sometimes when I drive by, always so dedicated, locked in here with all these stories." My heart began to race. He wasn't just a lost customer. He had been watching me. The sense of security I had always felt in this place began to crumble.
"Well, it's 9 o'clock now, sir. I really need to close up." I tried to make my voice sound firm, but a tremor betrayed it. He turned to face me fully, with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Yes, closing time." Instead of heading for the door, he began to walk slowly in my direction. Panic seized me. I was at the back of the store, and he was between me and the only exit. Every step he took on the wooden floor echoed like a drumbeat in my chest. "You know, Clara," he said, and my blood ran cold when I heard my name, which was on my name tag. "Sometimes the scariest stories aren't in the books." He stopped just a few feet from me, completely blocking my path to the front door. The street outside was deserted. No one would hear me scream. My survival instinct kicked in. Years of watching horror movies and reading thrillers suddenly felt like training. I glanced at the shelf beside me, in the art book section. Without a second thought, I grabbed the heaviest volume I could find, a massive encyclopedia of Renaissance art. With all the strength I could muster, I hurled it in his direction. I wasn't aiming for him, but for the large plate glass window next to the door. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening, echoing down the silent street. The store's glass break alarm instantly went off, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that tore through the night. The man, caught off guard by the noise and my reaction, hesitated for one crucial second.
That hesitation was all I needed. As he instinctively turned toward the sound of the alarm, I sprinted in the opposite direction, toward the back door that led to a small alley. I never used it, but I knew it was unlocked from the inside. I shoved the door open and ran into the cold, rainy darkness of the alley without looking back. I ran like I had never run in my life, with the sound of the store's alarm still wailing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main street, where I finally saw the flashing lights of an approaching car. It was a police cruiser, likely responding to the alarm. I waved my arms desperately, crying and shaking.
The officers took me to the station, and I told them everything. They went back to the bookstore, but the man was gone. They never found him. The owner of the store, a kind old man, installed security cameras and insisted that no one ever worked the closing shift alone again. I continued to work there, but the feeling of sanctuary the bookstore represented for me had been permanently tainted. Every night when I locked that door, even with company, I couldn't help but glance at the shadows on the street, imagining those cold, blue eyes watching me from the darkness, a reminder that true terror often hides behind a facade of normalcy.
My name is Marco, and ever since I moved near a large forest preserve, hiking has been my therapy. At least once a week, I'd put on my boots, grab my backpack, and spend hours exploring the trails. There was one in particular, the Dry Creek Trail, that was my favorite. It was a moderately difficult route, well marked, that I knew like the back of my hand. The solitude of the forest never scared me. On the contrary, I found it invigorating. The sound of the wind in the trees and the calls of birds were the perfect soundtrack for clearing my head. I always felt completely safe out there, as if nature itself was a shield against the complications of the world. On a sunny Saturday morning in early fall, I started my usual hike, feeling the crisp air and the warmth of the sun on my back. About an hour into the hike, I came across another man on the trail, which was a bit unusual for that more remote section. He looked to be in his early 60s, with graying hair, a neat beard, and the kind of hiking gear that suggested a lot of experience. He greeted me with a friendly smile, and we started chatting. He introduced himself as Arthur and said he'd been hiking these trails for decades. We talked about gear, about the weather, and he seemed genuinely personable and knowledgeable. His presence was comforting, that of a seasoned veteran of the mountains who knew what he was doing. I felt absolutely nothing amiss about him, just the common camaraderie between two lovers of the outdoors. That's when he mentioned a detour. "You know, son," he said, gesturing toward an almost invisible opening in the foliage, "most people stick to this beaten path, but the real beauty is off-trail. There's a hidden waterfall about 20 minutes from here. It's not on any map." The idea was tantalizing. A secret waterfall? It sounded like the kind of discovery every hiker dreams of making. My natural caution told me to stay on the marked path, but the confidence Arthur exuded and his apparent expertise convinced me. "Come on," he urged with a grin. "I'll lead the way. You won't regret it." And, against my better judgment, I agreed and followed him into the dense woods. The new trail was really just a faint path through thick undergrowth.
After a few minutes, the main trail was no longer visible, and the familiar sounds of the forest seemed different, more muffled and ominous. That's when Arthur's tone began to shift. His friendly banter turned into something darker. He started telling stories about people who had gotten lost in these woods, about how the forest swallows the careless. At first, it just sounded like spooky campfire talk, but there was a strange glint in his eye. "It's amazing how someone can disappear out here and never be found," he said, looking around. "Just one wrong step." Then he asked about my car in the parking lot, describing it in detail. "A blue sedan, right? I saw you pull in. You live alone in town, don't you?" Fear began to creep in, cold and sharp. How did he know that? The alarm bells in my head went off. The waterfall felt more and more like a lie. I stopped and said, "You know, Arthur, I think I'm gonna head back. I just remembered I have an appointment." I tried to sound casual, but my voice wavered. His smile vanished. "Head back? But we're almost there. Don't be a coward. We've come this far." His voice was no longer friendly. It held a tone of command, an insistence that made me deeply uncomfortable. He took a step toward me, blocking the narrow path back. "You wouldn't want to get lost trying to find your way back alone, would you?" The threat was veiled, but clear. I was miles from civilization, in a place I didn't know, with a man who suddenly seemed like a predator. The silence of the forest was now a prison. Panic threatened to paralyze me, but I knew I had to think fast. My only advantage was my age and physical condition. I looked down at the ground, pretending to consider his offer. "All right, you're right," I said, trying to buy myself a moment. Then I feigned a trip on a tree root, letting out a cry of pain and dropping to my knees, clutching my ankle. "I think I twisted it bad," I yelled. Arthur moved closer, his expression a mix of irritation and concern. "Let me see," he said, crouching down in front of me. The moment he reached out to touch my ankle, I used all my strength to shove him in the chest with both feet. He toppled backwards, surprised, and I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran without direction, just away from him, with the sound of him screaming curses behind me. Pure adrenaline pumped from my veins. Branches scratched my face and arms, but I didn't dare stop. Eventually, the yelling faded, but I kept running, guided only by the sun, hoping to find the main trail. After what felt like an eternity, I finally stumbled out of the woods, back onto the familiar dirt of the Dry Creek Trail. I have never been so relieved to see a marked path. I ran the rest of the way to the parking lot, got in my car, and locked the doors, gasping for air. Weeks later, I saw a missing person poster on the community bulletin board. It was a young tourist who was last seen near the forest preserve. The police never found a trace. I never went back to that trail again. The forest, once my refuge, now holds the memory of that face and the terrifying certainty that I almost became another story about someone the woods swallowed whole. When my wife and I bought our first house, we wanted the exact opposite of the city life we'd left behind. We found the perfect place, an old house with a few acres of land at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by dense woods. The peace was absolute. There were no visible neighbors except for a single farmhouse nearly a mile away, owned by an old man named Silas. In the first few days, the seclusion was idyllic. We would sit on the porch at night, listening to the crickets and looking up at a sky so full of stars it seemed unreal. We were building our own little paradise, away from everything and everyone. We felt a sense of security that only complete isolation seemed to offer.
A week after we moved in, Silas showed up. He drove his old tractor over to our property and introduced himself with a thick country accent and a firm handshake. He seemed like the archetypal country neighbor, helpful, a bit nosy, but harmless. He gave us tips about the well, about which wood was best for the fireplace, and told us stories about the family who had lived in the house before us. We were grateful for his kindness and felt good knowing someone was nearby if we ever needed help. In the following weeks, however, his neighborliness started to become a little odd. He would appear without warning, sometimes early in the morning, other times late at night, always with a flimsy excuse.
The strangeness escalated slowly. One morning, we found a thick rope with a perfectly tied hangman's noose hanging from our front gate. There was no note, nothing. When we asked Silas about it, he just laughed and said it must have been some kids playing a prank. On another occasion, he left a gift bucket on our porch, which contained several old, rusted garden tools, including a small scythe. He started making comments about our routine. "See you leave for work at 7 every morning, David," he said one day while I was in the yard, "and Sarah likes to read on the porch till the sun goes down." The idea that he was watching us from his distant farmhouse with binoculars began to haunt us. The peace we had sought was turning into a constant state of paranoia.
The turning point came when our dog, a normally gentle Labrador, began acting erratically. Every night, around the same time, he would run to the back window, which faced the woods in the direction of Silas's property, and start to let out a low, incessant growl. One night, I was woken up by Max's frantic barking. I went to the window and saw nothing but darkness. The next morning, however, I found heavy boot prints in the soft mud around the house, circling every window and door. They were large prints, the same type of work boots Silas always wore. Someone had been walking around our house in the middle of the night while we slept, and the only person for miles was him. The fear became unbearable. We decided to install discreet security cameras aimed at the perimeter of the house. We wanted concrete proof before going to the police, knowing that the word of city folk against a long-time local farmer might not be taken seriously. A few days went by without incident, and we started to think maybe we were overreacting. Perhaps the footprints belonged to a hunter. We were almost convincing ourselves of this when, on a Friday night, I decided to check the previous night's footage out of habit. What I saw made my heart stop. The footage, grainy in the night vision, showed a figure standing at the tree line right at the edge of our property. It was Silas. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, motionless, staring at our house. The timestamp on the recording showed that he stood there for over 2 hours, from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., just watching. What was he waiting for? What would he have done if I didn't have a dog or if we hadn't locked our doors? The image of him standing in the darkness, a patient predator in waiting, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation. He wasn't just an odd neighbor, he was a silent, calculated threat.
We took the tape to the police the next day. The sheriff recognized Silas immediately, sighed, and said he was a bit eccentric.
but that there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't trespassed. They promised to have a talk with him. That night, Silas's porch light, which had never been on before, stayed lit all night, casting a sickly yellow glow through the woods toward our house. We put the house up for sale the following week and moved out as soon as we could. We never knew what his true intentions were, but the image of that motionless figure watching us in the dead of night haunts us to this day. We learned the hard way that sometimes isolation doesn't bring safety. It just leaves you further away from help.